Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Whaling Museum. My name's Niles Parker. I'm the Gosnell Executive Director here at the Nantucket Historical Association. And as many of you may know, we have been exploring the American Revolution this week at the NHA, while collaborating with the Museum of the American Revolution to host a replica of George Washington's field tent, or the first Oval Office, up at the old mill for the last few days, and some related programming, including a wonderful lecture here 2 nights ago by the museum's president, Scott Stevenson. For those of you, and I see some faces who were here that night, it was a special night and a nice talk. I think tonight will be the same. Continuing in that vein, I'm very pleased to welcome a guy who probably doesn't need much of an introduction around these parts. Nantucket's own Nathaniel Philbrick is the author of 8 New York Times best-selling works of American history, including In the Heart of the Sea, winner of the 2000 National Book Award, and the basis of the 2015 movie of the same title, directed by Ron Howard. Mayflower, a finalist for the 2007 Pulitzer Prize in History. Many more books, including several about the American Revolution. Valiant Ambition, which was the winner of the George Washington Book Prize. Bunker Hill, In the Hurricane's Eye, and his latest, Travels with George. Nat's writing has appeared in Vanity Fair, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and the Boston Globe. And he has appeared on the Today Show, The Morning Show, Dateline, PBS's American Experience, C-SPAN, and NPR. Tonight, Nat will share with you some of the insights he has gleaned about the American Revolution through his research and writing over the years. I know we're in for a treat. Nat, thank you very much for coming to the Whaling Museum once again. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. It is great to be here tonight, and it's great to have Niles Parker back with the NHA. A round of applause. I'm so happy as a Nantucketer and a lover of history. And also, oh my gosh, to have George Washington's battlefield tent beside the old mill. I mean, that's the historic vortex I've been dreaming of for the last 13 years. I've been working on the American Revolution and then Washington's travels as president. I mean, oh my God, it's just, so to be here tonight is a real pleasure, and I will be talking about the American Revolution, but I warn you, since Travels with George is my latest, I will inevitably be talking about that as well, because what I really have found with my 10-year engagement with the Revolution, 2 years longer than it took to fight the darn thing, is that nothing ended with the American Revolution. It was just the beginning of the revolution we will always be in the middle of here in the United States of America. So I'm going to sort of transition it into that book, particularly with an eye towards of course with George Washington, but also with 2 characters who were very close to him, particularly during his presidency, Thomas Jefferson, who was his Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton, who was his financial director. And how did I end up writing about the Revolution? Well, it was while researching Nantucket Island. One of the great books from the 18th century is Hector St. Jean de Crevecoeur's Letters from an American Farmer. There are 12 letters, and almost half of them are about Nantucket. He was a Frenchman who fought on the side of France during the 7 Years' War. He ends up in America under unusual circumstances. No one's quite sure what happened, but he ends up married to an American with a farm on the Hudson River. And Crevecoeur, who came from petty nobility in Normandy, France, is in love with America. It's everything he hated about France. It's a place where it doesn't make any difference what education, what nationality you are. You come to America, you have a new chance. He travels all over the 13 colonies, makes his way all the way down to Charleston. He He seems to have gotten all the way over to the Mississippi River, but it's Nantucket that he's infatuated by. He comes here at least twice in the years just prior to the American Revolution. He describes the island as a sandbank fertilized with whale oil only. You know, this is the example of, he sees it as a metaphor for America. For all it takes is know-how, ambition, and it doesn't matter the typography or the geography. If you have the ambition, you can make it. And so it's a love song, and through those 11 letters, and then it comes to the last letter, and something's happened. The American Revolution has broken out, and his utopia has been destroyed. He wonders, because he is perfectly happy with the way things are. The American citizens are the most prosperous, least taxed people in the Western Hemisphere. And we're having a revolution. He sees the English presence as nothing but benign. What's going on? Soon a group of patriots take over his town and demand a loyalty oath. And he says, I don't know a loyalty oath? Why? What's wrong? What's wrong with the way it is? The patriots come in, and his loyalist friends are forced to flee, many of them back to England. Their properties are confiscated. There's trials in the town. He thinks about he's going to move out into the West. He's going to live with the Indians. Eventually, and that's how Letters from an American Farmer ends, with this just feeling of despair. In real life, he would, with his eldest son, make his way to New York, which was then occupied by the British. Somehow, and he would then be arrested by the British, who thought he was an American spy. He languishes in jail for months. Eventually, he and his son, he has his manuscript with him. He's desperate to get out, and eventually they get on a ship. They are shipwrecked off the coast of Ireland. He and his son on a rock with his manuscripts. They make their way to London, and it's published in the later stages of the American Revolution. It's a big book in England, because the point is exactly what the English people want to see. And after reading this, I was going, well, this is not the American Revolution I grew up with. I grew up with the Revolution as a group of citizen farmers banding together and defeating the strongest army on earth, and thereby throwing off the shackles of British tyranny. What Crèvecoeur describes, and by the way, Crèvecoeur, broken heart, the poet John Berryman would refer to him as Mr. Heartbreak. Reading him, it's the revolution. It's the opposite. The revolution is a bunch of thugs who take over the farms of prosperous people who've worked very hard and are loyal to the government that has given these opportunities. I needed to find out what was going on. What was America? And I did not see myself writing 3 books about the American Revolution. What really got me started was, even though I have lived in Nantucket for 36 years, I grew up in that maritime center of the universe, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where, by the way, Adam, our previous speaker 2 nights ago, is also from Pittsburgh. So I'm very much looking forward to exchanging notes on that score. But and it was in Pittsburgh Elementary School, which was also where David McCullough happened to go, that I read Johnny Tremain. Oh my gosh, Johnny Tremain made into a terrific Disney movie, Esther Forbes. Johnny it's a work of fiction, but when I read this, I realized history was about real people like Johnny Tremain, like me, caught up in extraordinary events. It's not just statues and dates. And before we moved to Nantucket, we lived briefly in the north end of Boston, which is the historic core of Boston. And I was at home with our daughter, who was at that point a little over a year old. And afternoons, I would push that stroller through the crooked streets of the North End, inevitably making my way to Copp's Hill. And then, you know, those crooked stones. There was one of a patriot whose gravestone was used as target practice by the British during the occupation of the siege of Boston. And I'd look out, and there was the Bunker Hill Monument. And it got me to thinking, you know, Boston bears absolutely no resemblance other than that North End core to what it was like in the time of Johnny Tremaine. I wanted to know what it was like. So for the first time, I was an English major in college. I was not trained as a historian, but Sundays, when Melissa was home with Jenny, I would go to the Boston Public Library and start to research how Boston became, what it was like back then. It was an island of 1.1 square miles with 15,000 people on it, connected by a thin strip of land to Roxbury. And spring high tides, that what's called the neck would disappear. The Back Bay was the Back Bay before it was a neighborhood. And it was dominated by 3 hills of almost mountainous proportions, particularly Beacon Hill. And at that point on Nantucket, the year-round population was judged to be around 15,000. You know, I knew what it was like to live on an island community of that size. I didn't know everyone's name, but in the winter when you go to the grocery store, you kind of recognize everybody. It's and you go to town meeting, you know, that's American democracy at its bare-knuckled best. And, you know, where people shout at each other, our madam moderator tries to calm things down, but somehow a consensus is reached. And I thought, well, and all my books tend to be about situations in which a group of people, whether they be a whale ship crew, 102 passengers on the Mayflower, Custer's regiment, making its way to the Little Bighorn. I like to write about groups of people under enormous stress. And I thought, well, what would it be like to write about 15,000 people, the size of Nantucket, under the enormous pressures of a revolution? And so that's what led me to write Bunker Hill. And Bunker Hill, it was an extraordinary experience, seeing that city in a whole new light. And I was introduced, and really the main character in that book is Dr. Joseph Warren, someone that most of us never heard of. But while John Adams, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock were away on their way to the Second Continental Congress, and things were heating up in Boston, the British by this point had occupied Boston, and tensions were very high. It was Joseph Warren, in his 30s, a doctor, John Adams' personal doctor, with a widower with 3 young children under 12 years old. It was Joseph Warren who was really organizing the work of a revolution. He was the one who pressed the button that sent Paul Revere to warn the communities around that the British were coming. He was the man. And then, the Lexington and Conquer occurs. He makes his way across Charles River, and the British have made their way to Concord, and now are trying to fight their way back to Boston as the militiamen come out from town after town and dogging them all the way. And it's house to house fighting all the way there. And Joseph Warren makes his way out there. He's there. At one point, he was a very snappy dresser, apparently. And, he had his hair, in those curls. And at one point, a British musket ball takes out his hairpin. This was a different kind of leader. This was a political leader who was charismatic, who was eloquent, and would become a major general by the time of Bunker Hill. He would die at Bunker Hill. This would be a loss to the Americans, But after 3 charges by the British, in which the casualties were close to 50%, more losses than any other battle in the Revolution to come, after that battle, General Howe, when he heard that, and when he was shown Joseph Warren's body, would say, this is worth 500 men. A loyalist would later say that if Joseph Warren had lived, George Washington would have been a non-entity. That's probably overstating the case. It's a loyalist trying to get a dig into George Washington. And yet that does state this person was absolutely essential. And what surprised me was not only the importance of George Washington, but what happens just a few weeks later when the new commander of the Continental Army shows up, George Washington. This was not the George Washington who looks at us solemnly from the $1 bill. This was George Washington in his early 40s, his hair still reddish brown, not happy to be in Boston with this group of militiamen. You know, he's from hierarchical Virginia, and when he gives an order, he's used to people obeying those orders. That's not the way the militiamen were. You know, you give that group an order, they say, whoa, wait a minute. We'd be happy to discuss that, and if we think it's a good idea, we're with you. This was not, Washington did not react positively to this thing, and some tensions resulted. I've always thought if Joseph Warren had lived, he would have been the perfect transitional person for Washington as he came in and took charge of the army. Eventually, and what amazed me was how aggressive Washington was. This was not the cool, defensive-minded general that would ultimately win the revolution. This is someone who didn't see how this ragtag group of militiamen could survive a long-term war. He wanted to finish it. Even though he didn't have enough gunpowder, he wanted to attack the British who were dug into Boston. It would have been suicidal. Repeatedly, his Council of War unanimously voted him down. Once again, this was a different General Washington. Ultimately, the decision was made to take the high ground at Dorchester Heights. The young officer who Washington had picked to be the head of artillery, Henry Knox, a bookseller. Everything he knew about the war was read in his bookstore. Henry Knox, Washington recognized something in him and made the highly controversial decision to make him the head of the artillery. There were several officers quit because of this. It would be Knox, however, who would make his way to Fort Ticonderoga, where there were dozens of desperately needed cannons in winter, put those cannons on sleds that he made, pull those cannons by oxen and horses down the frozen Hudson River to Albany. One of the cannons would go through the ice. They'd retrieve it, and for the rest of the Revolution, that cannon would be named Albany. And then they would make their way across snow-covered Massachusetts, across the Berkshires. It was tough going up, but the going down was really difficult because those sleds just wanted to take off. And so the sailors in the army rigged tackles to ease them down the mountainside. The artillery would arrive in Framingham, and in a brilliant nighttime maneuver, enough of those cannons would be on a temporary fort on Dorchester Heights at night. William Howe would look up from Boston and realize he had no choice but to evacuate because the British Navy in the harbor would have been the end. And so negotiations were made, and in March, off went the British with a lot of loyalists with them. And so I thought that was going to be the end, but I said, what's going to happen to George Washington? How does he become the general we know about? And so I decided one of my mother's heroes. My mother was a different kind of person. My mother marched to the drum of a different drummer. For one thing, she smoked a pipe, which was interesting on Friday evenings at the restaurant when she and my dad would light up. It was quite the thing. But her personal hero was Benedict Arnold. And, growing up, I was like, Mom, what the heck are you talking about? That's Benedict Arnold. He personifies evil. You're just trying to be the contrarian you've always been. She said, no, there's more to the story than you think. Well, I am here tonight to tell you that Mom was right. And I decided I wanted to talk about the middle years of the war. Because the middle years of the war were when this conflict that had begun in Boston, and Washington would suffer a terrible defeat in New York. There would be the great comeback at Trenton, but it would devolve into a sordid civil war. It was particularly bad in the South, but it was also bad around New York, where the British would occupy New York. There were what were known as the Whaleboat Wars, where groups of gangs with loyalist and patriotic sympathies would have nighttime raids, burn each other's towns. These were often former neighbors going after each other. It was just horrible. Along the Hudson, where the American army was with Washington, up towards West Point, there was something called the neutral ground, where it was where forces from the British, from New York, and the Americans would gangs. They call it. They were the Cowboys and the Skinners would just fight it out. People evacuated. It was it was just awful. So I wanted to I wanted to explore this, and so I decided to pair George Washington with Benedict Arnold, someone who begins as arguably our best general, or battlefield general. He would, a little-known naval action on Lake Champlain at Valcour Island, where Washington loses New York. The British occupy New York. If they can go up the Hudson and meet up with another force coming down from Canada through the Richelieu River to Lake Champlain, across Lake George for Fort Ticonderoga, if they can link up, New England will be sealed off from the rest of the former colonies, and it's game over for America. And against all odds, Arnold wins the Battle of Valcour. He doesn't win, but much like Bunker Hill, he puts a fear into the British Navy on Lake Champlain. And by the way, as a kid, my father was an English professor at Pitt, but he had been an English professor at Vermont before, and so we had a summer camp on Mount Mansfield. So I grew up on Lake Champlain. That's actually where I learned how to sail, and knew Lake Champlain quite well. And so that was just a fascinating thing to see that whole area in an entirely new light. And so that book begins with Washington at his lowest, with the retreat across New Jersey to the other side of the Delaware, and Benedict Arnold, the new hero that saves America in 1776. What Arnold sets up just a year later is the great victory at Saratoga, where he will be badly injured. Several times he's been denied the promotion he feels he's due. Washington agrees with him. And I think there was some envy on Washington's part. If I had been 10 years younger, I could be like Benedict Arnold there, fighting it out on the field. Here he was at headquarters, trying to deal with a Continental Congress that was extremely concerned about Washington's increasing stature in the military. Every other revolution in which a republic was the intended result, whether it was Caesar, whether it was Cromwell, had ended with a military coup. So the Continental Congress, particularly John Adams and the congressmen from New England, were very insisted that they keep a sharp eye on Washington, and insisted on selecting his major generals. And that was part of the reason why Arnold was overlooked for promotion because there already were 2 major generals from Connecticut, and they were only going to have 2 major generals per state. And so, come on. Anyways, a dysfunctional Congress is nothing new. And so the book follows as Washington, particularly at Valley Forge, there is an attempt to replace him with the hero of Saratoga, Horatio Gates, who basically steals the glory that rightfully was Arnold's. Arnold is horribly injured, and his life he's on a downward spiral. Eventually, he marries Peggy Shippen and comes up with the plan of attempting to surrender West Point to the British. And it is foiled, but Washington, who by this point has looked to a young French officer, Lafayette, has become a kind of surrogate son to him. And Lafayette is there with Washington, as is Alexander Hamilton and Henry Knox, and they are there with him at Arnold's headquarters on the Hudson, right across the river from West Point, and learn that Arnold, who by this time has fled down the river and ultimately makes his way to British-occupied New York, and learn that he has tried to betray them all. Washington turns to Lafayette and says, who can we trust now? I think that's it. My gosh, where are we? And that's pretty much where Valiant Ambition ends. It's the last book in the trilogy, In the Hurricane's Eye, that is the year of Yorktown, that for me as a former sailing journalist and a former sailor was truly a kind of personal culmination. This was because the premise of that book is we all look to Yorktown as the great victory that made independence possible. The fact of the matter is there would have been no siege at Yorktown, no defeat of General Cornwallis if a naval battle fought between the British and French had not been won by the French. It's called the Battle of the Chesapeake or the Battle of the Capes. It was fought towards the entrance of the Chesapeake, where and this is where I began to. We think of Washington as permanently rooted to his horse, a kind of centaur. The fact is, Washington was very dialed into naval aspects of the military. Hey, his home, Mount Vernon, is named for a British admiral, Admiral Vernon, who had been revered by his older brother. He desperately wanted, as a young man, to become a British midshipman. He had his trunk packed and was about to go until his mother said, "You can't leave me, George." His father had died, and he didn't go that direction. At Mount Vernon, he had a schooner, a copper-bottom schooner, which is very high tech in the 18th century. And this was someone who knew the water. When when they were dug in there and on the Hudson River, and they transported themselves by water. And remember, this is before highways. This waterways were how you got yourself and armies around. They would transport themselves by boat. A French ambassador was arriving, and they sailed. Washington, they've made arrangements to pick him up at Fishkill, New York. The vessel arrives, and who is steering? George Washington. They get aboard. They start heading down to his headquarters. A storm comes up. Washington is the one at the helm. The French emissary, just can't believe it. And later, Henry Knox, after the great victory at Yorktown, would write to Nathaniel Greene, one of his best friends, and the general whom Washington trusted the most, the general whom Washington would send south to do battle with Lord Cornwallis during that final year and a half. Knox would write to him, "Washington although previously great, has is our, and he says, our North River captain. The Hudson was known as the North River. Our North River captain has now outdone himself. And so Washington, to them, was known as the North River captain. And so Washington understood the sea. He understood how the only way America was going to win this thing was if the French could neutralize the British Navy. For most of the war, the British Navy commanded the coast, even during the Siege of Boston. The only reason the British survived that was because their Navy could get in and out of Boston Harbor. If the Americans were going to hand the British a defeat they needed, it would have to be with the assistance of the French. But it would take years after the French joined the Revolution in 1778 to convince the French to coordinate in an effective way. And it was Washington who was constantly hammering this through. Initially, he wants them to attack New York, because it was only in New York, where there were 10,000 British soldiers, that you could have a potential victory big enough to bring the British to the negotiating table. At that point, Lord Cornwallis was down in the South moving around. There was nothing near what would ultimately be. But the French don't want to go to into New York Harbor. They had tried earlier and basically thought, well, there's a bar at the entrance, and decided that their ships, it was not safe. And they didn't want to try it again. So they, and by this time, a small army, a French army, is made its way to America and is stationed at Newport, Rhode Island, under General Rochambeau, about 5,000 soldiers with a small French naval force. But they're stuck there because there's a English blockade. Horatio Gates, that hero of Saratoga, Congress picks him to go south. He suffers one of the worst defeats of the war in Camden, North Carolina. It's looking horrible there. That's when Washington sends down Nathaniel Greene, who will do his best to battle Lord Cornwallis. In the meantime, Benedict Arnold is now a brigadier general with the British Army. And the decision is made to send him to the Chesapeake, to George Washington's home area. And that December, Benedict Arnold is sent down with a small army, and he ends up at the mouth of the James River, and he quickly proves that he just might be the best general in both armies. He makes his way up the James River, all the way to Richmond, where Governor Thomas Jefferson, who has made absolutely minimal efforts to neutralize the sudden appearance of a British army on the James River, is forced to flee his headquarters as Arnold ravages the James River. The capital had been moved from Williamsburg to Richmond because it was assumed a British army could not get up that far, not Arnold. He goes up there. Thomas Jefferson, who quickly realizes he's not built to be a wartime governor, is so despondent, he ultimately says, I'm out of here, I quit. It creates great rage. It's a kind of scandal that will haunt him for the rest of his career. And meanwhile, Washington wants to neutralize Benedict Arnold, so he sends down Lafayette. And Lafayette goes cat and mouse with Arnold, who is eventually replaced by Cornwallis, who has suffered one of those victories that decimates his army in North Carolina, at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, with our fighting Quaker. We love fighting Quakers on Nantucket. Nathaniel Greene pushing, basically convincing him to head to Virginia. It's all beginning to come together with Cornwallis making his way to Virginia. Washington is desperate and it's so bad down there that before he quits, Jefferson pleads with George Washington to lead an army down to Virginia. He says, if you come down, you will rally the people. Washington says, please come down here. And Washington realizes that with Rochambeau and Newport, he has higher priorities than defending his home. Mount Vernon is imperiled. Mount Vernon is almost burned by the British. He realizes his highest priority is the alliance with the French. He must stay in New York. And so he's working feverishly to try to get this. And at his side for the last few years has been Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, Washington plucks him from the artillery, realizes he's one of the brightest human beings on the planet, and he becomes Washington's right-hand man, writes his orders, is there all the time. But Hamilton is chafing. He wants to be in the field. He really does. It's very tense at headquarters. They're trying to deal with the British in the Chesapeake, and at the headquarters, Washington says to his office was upstairs. He says to Hamilton, I need you. I need to get you some orders. And Hamilton says, wait, I have to get these orders to Lafayette. This is just before Lafayette is sent down. He goes down. Lafayette's very excitable, starts talking to him. Hamilton says, look, I got to get back up there to General Washington. Finally, he goes up, and there is Washington at the head of the stairs in an absolute fury. And he says to Hamilton, you dishonor me, sir, by not responding and coming here in time. And Hamilton says, if that's how you feel, and I'm paraphrasing here, with this we part. He would transition out, but that was the break. He thought, my career in the Continental Army is over. Well, it becomes clear that when the French sail into the Chesapeake, what's going to happen? They're going to have to march the army from New York. By this time, Rochambeau is linked up with the American army on the Hudson. They're going to march 500 miles to Yorktown and try to lay the trap as the French Navy is there. Hamilton is convinced, he's out of this, but no, Washington realizes he's too valuable. He becomes part of the army. He's given the role he should have, and down they go. The French, for the first time in decades, win a naval battle against the British. It's amazing, because if this hadn't happened, the French would have lost, the British would have sailed into the Chesapeake, evacuated Lord Cornwallis, and there would have been no defeat. It all hung on that naval battle. Washington gets there, there's the siege, and it's the great victory, where Hamilton plays, takes Redoubt number 10 in that great dramatic play, and he's an essential part of the army. Meanwhile, Jefferson, while all of this is happening in Yorktown, while history is being made, he is in seclusion on the other side of the state, writing the book, Notes on the State of Virginia. Takes no part of it. And which is an interesting, their personalities are so different. Okay, now let's fast forward 8 years. Throughout that whole time, I kept wanting Washington to have that high five moment. I have won this thing. He would never feel that, because what he realized, winning the American Revolution was impossible. It never should have happened. But the real hardship was, how do you make a government that can govern these people who have revolted from the strongest military power on earth because they didn't want to get taxed? How are you going to create a federal government that is going to tax these people, that is going to create some kind of order out of all this? The one thing Washington learned throughout his 8 years as commander was that the Continental Congress, which had no taxing power, was ineffective. They couldn't provide him with any support. There needed to be something else. There's the Constitutional Convention. And Washington, even though he did not want to become president, the most reluctant president we've ever had, Washington agrees and is president. Now, we think of the Constitution as the document that holds this country together. It was what I think is underappreciated is how controversial the Constitution was. It divided the country into those that supported the Constitution and the strong central government it created, and those who distrusted the very existence of a central government that strong, that believed the states should retain the power that they had had under the original Articles of Confederation. When Washington was inaugurated, 2 states, North Carolina and, of course, Rhode Island, had not yet ratified the Constitution. He realized he needed to do something to unite this already divided country. And on top of that, there were regional differences. When the governor of Virginia said, "my country," he didn't mean the United States of America. He meant Virginia. He needed to do something to pull this group of 13 former colonies together. Now, this is before mass media. He could not get on the radio or the television and deliver the message. He needed to go out there and visit all 13 states. And so he did not do it in Air Force One. He did it in a horse-drawn carriage. During the New England tour, he would visit 60 towns alone. The Southern tour would take him 3 months, take him all the way down to Savannah, Georgia. No security detail to speak of, about a dozen people as part of his entourage, and he would pull it off. By the end of these 2 years, the American people would begin to think of themselves as something, as the United States of America, and recognize that, yes, they had a president who was not a king, was not a dictator. He was one of them. He had been elected. And so as Washington is finishing up that Southern tour, trying to unite the country, things are happening within his own cabinet. Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, has become increasingly unhappy with the economic policies that the Washington administration is putting forward, and with the federal government getting stronger and stronger in terms of taxation power. Hamilton looks to Great Britain as his model, especially in creating a national bank. While Thomas Jefferson, a quintessential anti-federalist, looks to France and the new revolutionary fervor that is happening there. Jefferson has been ambassador to France for a number of years, and they just do not see eye to eye. And so within his own cabinet, before the end of his own term, there is a revolution happening. And what's happening is the partisanship takes over the country. By the end of Washington's second term, it's as bad as it is today in terms of just the low level of discord. And Washington fears that everything he has worked so hard to create will fall apart. While he's finishing that Southern tour, while he's making his way back and stopping off on the Potomac to try to create what will become Washington, D.C., Thomas Jefferson and his friend James Madison depart on their own northern tour up to Vermont, the new state of Vermont. They make their way up Lake George to Lake Champlain and are headed to Burlington in a sloop when the north winds turn them back. Jefferson writes to Washington, "I'm doing this for my health." What Hamilton later learns is that Madison and Jefferson used this trip to begin to organize, to create the two-party system, to organize an opposition party that will become the Democratic Republican Party. They stop in New York and meet with a man destined to kill Alexander Hamilton in a duel, Aaron Burr. Similar kinds of political meetings happen in Albany and even in Brattleboro, Vermont. And so what I'd like to do now is to end my talks tonight by reading a short passage from the epilogue of Travels with George. My wife, Melissa, and I, and our dog, Dora, doing our best to imitate John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, one of the great nonfiction books of all time, where Steinbeck, feeling he had lost touch with his country, heads out with his standard poodle, Charlie, and in search of the meaning of America. Melissa and I and our toller, Dora, retraced Washington's travels across this country. And we followed the southern tour, made our way back to Philadelphia, which was then the temporary capital. I said, Melissa, I'm afraid we're not done. We have to follow Jefferson and Madison's northern travels. And so we made our way, and my brother, given our Vermont roots, now has a house in Stowe, Vermont. And Travels with George is history meets travelogue meets memoir. It's a combination of, it's really 3 different stories interwoven. And so this, where I take up, begins with Melissa, myself, Dora, my brother and his wife, on the summit of Mount Mansfield, looking towards Lake Champlain, where we imagine Jefferson and Madison making their way towards Burlington. Standing on Mount Mansfield at the end of summer, I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness. Our travels with George had come to an end just as the story of the new nation was beginning. Jefferson and Madison would return to Philadelphia and continue to organize the political resistance, confident they were battling the pernicious forces of monarchy and corruption. In the meantime, Hamilton and the Federalists, equally confident in their righteousness, pushed forward the financial programs on which today's economy, with all its excesses and inequalities, is built. In the middle was Washington, a Federalist for sure, but a Federalist who recognized there was another point of view. What bothered him were not the philosophical differences between his 2 warring cabinet members, but their unwillingness to work cooperatively. Differences in political opinions are as unavoidable as, to a certain point, they may perhaps be necessary, he wrote to Hamilton. When matters get to such lengths, the natural inference is that both sides have strained the cords beyond their bearing, and that a middle course would be found the best until experience shall have pointed out the right mode, or, which is not to be expected because it is denied to mortals, there shall be some infallible rule by which we could forejudge events. What both Hamilton and Jefferson needed, Washington seemed to be saying, was a little more humility and self-doubt, because no one, not even the 2 most brilliant men of their age, had all the answers. Unlike Hamilton and Jefferson, Washington didn't need to be right all the time. He just wanted to make things work. He understood that feasible change is not attained by righteous indignation. It's understanding that the road ahead is full of compromises if life is actually going to get better. Not Jefferson. When it came to his beloved French Revolution, he insisted that rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated. Were there but an Adam and Eve left in every country and left free, it would be better than it is now. This kind of philosophical dogmatism and melodrama was anathema to Washington. He had spent 8 years of his life doing his best to prevent the United States from succumbing to the divisions and violence that were about to consume France. He understood the darkness of self-interest lurking beneath the most high-minded ideals, and yet despite his inherent skepticism concerning the human condition, he had an abiding faith in the American people. Although we may be a little wrong now and then, Washington wrote to his former aide-de-camp, Jonathan Trumbull, Jr., we shall return to the right path with more avidity. Thomas Jefferson had written the Declaration of Independence, but it had been left to George Washington to translate its words into something real, into something that might one day evolve into what the preamble to the Constitution calls a more perfect union. Thank you very much. Yeah, sure. Hi, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Yes? Yes. Looking at, the question is, how come we never hear about the British and Nantucket? A few words about the revolution on Nantucket. The Nantucketers, much like Crevecoeur, wanted no part of the American Revolution because all their whale oil went to London. It was Nantucket whale oil that was, lighting the streets. I mean, it was a disaster for the island, and the Patriot forces, particularly on Cape Cod, saw this as a Tory island, and so what happened was you saw Nantucket was basically attacked by both sides. You had the Patriots coming over from the Cape and harassing people right and left. And then you had a British force that had burned New Bedford and that was in Martha's Vineyard and was going to head towards Nantucket. It's been called the Quaker Wind. Contrary winds ultimately convinced them to not come to Nantucket. But this was not Nantucket's finest hour when it came to the patriotic cause. I mean, this is where the island stood. During the War of 1812, Nantucket was in a similar position. It would actually negotiate its own private treaty with Great Britain. Needless to say, the rest of America was not pleased with that turn of events. When Ralph Waldo Emerson visited the island to dedicate the new Athenaeum that had sprung up from the ashes of the Great Fire of 1846, he would write in his notebook, "Nation of Nantucket, which makes its own war and peace." Any other questions? All right, well, listen, thank you very much and have a great weekend.